podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Maxwell's House is brought to you by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Maxwell's House with Ray Maxwell and Dr. Kiki Sanford, Episode 63, The History of the U.S. Space Program.
This episode of Maxwell's House is brought to you by Audible.com. To download a free audiobook of your choice, go to audiblepodcast.com/house. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Maxwell's House. I'm Dr. Kiki Sanford, and here on Skype is Ray Maxwell, the host of your wonderful foray into so many areas of aviation science and color in many times. But today, episode 63, we're talking about space, right?
That's right. And the kind of, I got to thinking about, I'm 65 now, I'm retired, and I got to thinking about threads that have run through my life. And one of the threads that runs through my life is the space program. And I've had a very, very tiny peripheral role in that area. And so I thought, well, I'm going to review the space program and throw in a few Maxwell stories about my contact with the space program throughout my life.
That sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Sometimes you have news in the beginning of the show that kind of brings us into the storyline for the day's show. Did you have any news this week?
Well, the thing that did, bring this to my attention, of course, was the news that there has been a significant cutback in the manned program that was, returning to the moon. And that got me to thinking about the space program and the history of it, what it has contributed so far, and what, role it may play in our future and how important or unimportant or what have you. Those are all debatable topics for us. I do want to cover just a couple of questions I got in my email and so forth, but it was the news of the cutback that stimulated my interest into going back and saying, hey, you know what? You had some contact with the space program and the history of it. Why don't you review it so that people, know what happened throughout your life connected with the space program and, what it's contributed. But before go ahead.
I was just going to say it has a huge history. The space program has a gigantic history, and it's been so influential in so many ways, but we run up against so many economic troubles that have, push the ways that we think about the importance of something like space research, space travel, putting satellites in space. All of these things are put into perspective by how we're doing economically. And so, I think that'll be a fascinating movement through space and time.
Precisely. Before I jump into it, though, I want to answer a few emails that I got. One fellow wrote me and said, gee, Ray, you live in Canada and you tell all these stories. And when you're telling these stories, sometimes you use metric units and sometimes you use English units. And gee, most of the world is metric. It would help me a lot if you want to give them in English units, fine, but convert them to metric so I can visualize, because that's what I think in. So I want to answer that. Most of the time when I'm talking about photography or science, you will notice that I do, in fact, use metric units, because those, most of the time in my engineering career, those are the units that I've worked in. However, there is one area that I report on regularly that there is a reason why I report in the units that I do, and that's aviation. Now, in more than half of the world, in most of the Western world, and up until the collapse of the USSR, most of the world other than the USSR and China flew in a strange mix of units. And the mix of units that pilots work in is all altitudes in the Western world are reported in feet, and the flight levels that we fly at are measured in feet. So that's why when I'm talking about aviation, you will hear me refer to altitudes using feet. And that's what we fly in the Western world. Most of Europe, North and South America, all over, those are the units. Our airspeeds are in knots, nautical miles per hour, and our distances are in nautical miles. And then we have degrees and hours, minutes, seconds. That's all pretty standard. But altitudes in flying are reported in feet, and you're assigned, by air traffic control and flight planning and everything else. Now, I worked in the computerized flight dispatch business, and one of the things that we had to be very careful of and that we had to work on was whenever we were flying through Eastern airspace, like when we were doing a flight plan, a friend of mine sent me one as an example, a flight plan from Hong Kong to Zurich. Most of that flight over China and Russia is done in metric, and the air traffic control altitudes are in metric. By the way, the universal language spoken by all air traffic controllers is English, but we had to flight plan, and they don't have metric instruments in those Western airplanes, so we had to give them their altitudes rounded to the nearest 100 feet, but they were actually flying at metric altitudes to comply with ATC. So that's my note on that. I also made a comment about art and craft, and that's always dangerous. And one reader wrote in and said, gee, I've seen a lot of beautiful tables and things that I think are works of art. And I don't disagree. I think I didn't state clearly what I meant there. There are devices that are both functional and artistic, and there are art that is just art for art's sake that, serve only to stimulate our emotions, our feelings, tell a story, and so forth. So at any rate, that's my summary of items from email. And at the end of the program, I'll talk about, I'm going to cover some more questions and other areas later on in other shows. So with that, let's jump into the space program.
Yeah, let's jump right in.
Okay.
One day in is it distant past? No, not so distant.
Well, if I really wanted to start at the beginning of the space program, I would have to go back all the way to China and the fact that they invented rockets and, some of the early work there. But instead, I'm going to jump in to where I came along. I was born in August 7th, 1944, which was right near the end of World War II. So where I'm going to pick up the program is in Germany, because at that time in 1944, I believe by 44, the Germans were already sending V-1 rockets. Well, they weren't rockets, V-1 pulse jets to be correct. They were air-breathing jet engines, a very strange kind that you'd hardly ever see today, that are called pulse jets. And the nickname was buzz bomb because they made this buzzing sound. And to be fair, they were launched from a rail, and the launcher was a rocket, and shot them off the end of this rail. And the interesting thing about a pulse jet is it has to be going about 100 miles an hour before it'll work. So in other words, you have to throw this thing up in the air and get air going through it before you can even start it.
Right. I love these pulse jets, the oxygen breathing jet.
That's right. They breathed air and didn't carry any oxygen. But immediately at the same time, there was a group in Petamundo, I believe is the name of the area, where Werner von Braun and his team were, and by the way, they were using slave labor. That's a historical fact. Holocaust victims, essentially slaves, to build the V-2 rocket, which was a genuine liquid-fueled rocket, carried its own oxygen, carried its own fuel, and those were mixed in the engine compartment. Now, the good news is neither of these devices, the V-1 buzz bomb or the V-2, were very accurate. They aimed them over Great Britain, and they came down where they came down. And they didn't have a super precision guidance system like GPS or anything in those days. And consequently, they were strictly a terror weapon because they weren't very good at hitting strategic targets, like a munitions factory or a rail yard or what have you. But,
yeah, they pretty much just went in and mass destruction, just destroyed areas, and yeah.
Right. And they came very late in the war, and they actually were only used when the war was really swinging for, the Allies were already clearly winning by the time they came on site. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the U.S. and Great Britain and all the Allies at the end of the war were very concerned about two things as far as science goes. And that was these rockets, because it appeared that the Germans were well ahead of us there. And the other unknown, but was very frightening, is they were very concerned that the Germans might be ahead of us with regard to the A-bomb. Now, a long time ago, and I will look back in my notes, I thought I did a program here on Maxwell's house, but it turns out I think it goes back to the lab with Leo here in Canada. And I actually did a book report, if you will, on the German atomic bomb and the work towards it and why they didn't succeed.
Oh, that's interesting. That's if it was something that you did on the lab with Leo and not actually on Maxwell's house, that might make good fodder for a future episode.
Exactly. And I think I will dig out my notes on that, and because it's quite interesting. The Allies went to some effort to go into Germany and beat the Russians, because this was, the kind of starting of the Cold War, to get all of these scientists that were working on both the A-bomb project.
We must make the scientists ours. We must take their knowledge. We must get them to do what we want. They will do our bidding, the scientists. What?
Precisely. And of course, Werner von Braun did play a major role in starting the space program in the United States.
Wow.
And like I say, there was great controversy about him. And I remember when I worked at McDonnell Detweiler, here's another story for you. We had an opportunity to do a weather satellite ground station for South Africa. And this was when South Africa was still doing apartheid, and this was before Nelson Mandela. And so we were a small company, but a very politically conscious company. And we gathered everybody that worked there, and we discussed, should we do this project? And one of the quotes that one of the guys brought up that connects to this, Dave Sloan, who, when we were doing these satellite ground stations, he said, somebody said, well, hey, we're just scientists. We just build satellite ground stations. We're not responsible for how they're used. And he said, yeah, to quote Werner von Braun, I just build the rockets. They go up. Where they come down is not my concern.
There's something about that frame of mind that is, I just build them. It's not my responsibility. This has been the scientist. This is what gets scientists into trouble.
Exactly.
The perception that all scientists do is they're so into the work that they don't think of the consequences of the work that they're doing.
Right.
And that,
and to be fair, and to be honest, we finally, after a long discussion and basically unanimous consent by the employees, we did do the project. But the reason we did it is we decided we couldn't think of any way they could use a weather satellite ground station to discriminate against the people. And for doing the project, it got out locally, and we were picketed, because we did the project. But at any rate, on another show, I'll tell you about, we did projects with the Russians. I installed a satellite ground station in Czechoslovakia during détente, as part of détente, and we'll get into that another time. But at any rate, the next big step in my life where I noticed the space program happened in October 1957. And now this was a earth-shaking happening, and that was the launch of Sputnik.
Right.
And I'll just I'll tell you a few things about Sputnik, and then we'll talk about the impact of it. The first thing is it had a 96.2-minute orbit. So every hour and a half, this thing came overhead. All right? This thing flew over the United States, this object from Russia. This is scary. And it did create great fear because they were scared to death this was going to be weaponized in some way and they would be able to drop nukes on us. And we had to catch up. Now, the other thing that they did that I don't think any satellite has done since, you'll notice Sputnik has fairly long little antennae that stick out from it. And they had to have those long antennae because this thing transmitted on a very low frequency. And it transmitted on amateur radio, or in the area of amateur radio, it transmitted on 20.005 megahertz and 40.002 megahertz. Now, this is right next to the WWV time signals. So if you tuned in WWV and then just went a little bit higher in frequency, you'd hear the Sputnik. And you'd hear it every 90 minutes as it came over. And I was 13 years old at the time. And by this time, I was into amateur radio. And I had an all-band receiver. And I actually recorded the sound from the satellite. And if you want to hear what it sounded like, you can go to Wikipedia and hunt for Sputnik 1. And if you scroll down on the screen a little ways, you can actually play what it sounded like. You scroll down on the...
I'm working on that. There's some feedback somehow. That's interesting. Where is this playing? I must find something. I'll scroll down and find it. You go ahead.
Okay. But at any rate, when this all happened, I mean, this was a stroke of genius on their part to put it on frequencies that could be listened to by amateur radio operators, because everybody was recording it, everybody was hearing it, and you'd hear it, come over every 90 minutes, and then it would disappear as it went on around the Earth. So, there was no question. This unlike the conspiracy theories that we never went to the moon or anything, there was nobody sitting on the ground saying, hey, this thing isn't really up there. This is all a publicity stunt and fear-mongering by the Russians. There was no doubt it was there. And people were hearing it. And so the U.S., like no other time...
I think we just made contact.
Good. That was the sound of Sputnik 1. And the frequency that it sent out, the audio frequency and the spacing of it, telemetered down certain data about the temperature, and I forget something else. They also learned a lot about the density of space, that it wasn't a complete vacuum, that it's a very, very, extreme vacuum. And by monitoring the orbit of that satellite, it was really the first time we'd gotten anything out in space that far as I know. And they learned a lot about, there's the picture of it. And you can see the antennae that are connected to it. And they had to have fairly long antennae to transmit on 20 and 40 megahertz. Almost all satellites today are up in the UHF and VHF range that, transmit line of sight. So the U.S. was panicked, and they really, really went to work in a big way. And there were several groups in the U.S. that were very competitive at the time, and Werner von Braun was in one group, and I forget, the Air Force had their own group, and the Army had another group, and there were several rockets being built.
Yeah.
But now remember, this was October of 1957, and by January 31st, the U.S. got Explorer 1 launched. Now, I have to say that one of the images engraved in my brain was watching some of the attempts to launch satellites prior to that. There was the Vanguard missile, and I forget the names of all of them. But, they would have a big announcement. The U.S. did everything in public, and that was one of the big differences between Russia and the U.S. Russia didn't tell us they were going to do it until the thing was up and transmitting.
They didn't want to be embarrassed by the failures.
Yes,
maybe that's a...
And I'm sure they had some, but
yeah.
We would all gather around the television set, and we'd get all ready to watch one of these launchings of the U.S. first satellite. And they would fire the rocket, and it would crumble into a great ball of fire and explode, and everybody would in the vicinity would go running for cover. It was a very public embarrassment, what was happening with the early rockets that the U.S. was making. And they were really hustling to try and get the program going. Now, the next event that happened, and it was a couple of years later, Yuri Gagarin. Now, I want to say that
Yuri's night is coming up. I'm excited about that.
What's that?
Yuri's night is coming up to celebrate the first man in space, because officially Yuri Gagarin is the first man in space.
That's right. He was launched on April 12th, 1961. Prior to that, there were a couple of dogs and chimpanzees orbiting the Earth.
Right.
And everybody nicknamed, the Russians sent up dogs, and they were nicknamed Mutnik.
Mutnik.
Yeah. And the first chimpanzees, the first chimpanzee's name was Ham.
Ham.
Ham, right? And nice. I think some of the astronauts said, "Yeah, that's ham, spam in a can." there were.
You gotta love the sense of humor. It's fantastic.
And the astronauts, if you go and watch the movie The Right Stuff, the astronauts had to lobby for a window and for manual control in the satellite, because they said, "We're not going to be spam in a can." And sure enough, those manual controls came in very handy in some of the later space flights.
Yeah.
So at any rate, that jumps us to 1961. I was in high school by this time. And by the way, this had a major impact on what was happening at my high school. The science program got this incredible boost because, and hey, by the way, nobody was debating evolution. Nobody was debating various things that we're debating today that are scientifically proven. They were, every kid's got to learn science and math and quickly get ahead of the Russians in space. And so they sent federally funded science teachers to every little town. I mean, I was raised in a little town of 10,000, and we had a science teacher sent by the federal government to come and basically entertain us and get us excited about science. And
they're science entertainers.
That's right.
Not just teachers, but science entertainers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the next thing that came along and happened was the U.S. had to catch up. So Gagarin went up in April of 61. In May 5th, that's a very short time. The next month, Alan Shepard was the first U.S. person to go into space. Now, he did a suborbital flight. He did not go into orbit. Gagarin, on the Russians, at least the first one they told us about, they orbited the Earth. Alan Shepard did a suborbital flight. Virgil Grissom did a suborbital flight. And then the next Mercury capsule, that was John Glenn, on February 20th, 62, went up in a single-place capsule, Friendship 7, a Mercury capsule manufactured by McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, remember, I was raised in a little town of Nevada, Missouri, which is about 200 miles away from St. Louis. So these these spacecraft were being manufactured in my home state. So I thought that was pretty neat as a high school kid.
Well, that's something like that really brings it home. That's what's happening. And when you can actually have that local connection to the space race, to the building of the rockets, the satellites, whatever it happens to be, when you have that local connection, it just makes the science that's happening so much more palpable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, in this timeline, in 62, I graduated from high school, went off to the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, which was only now about 120 miles from St. Louis, where those spacecraft were being done.
Yeah.
And I'm going to throw in a couple of other things. What happened, the kind of key things that happened while I was in college was I remember vividly being in my physics class when I got the announcement that JFK had been assassinated.
Wow.
Okay. That was certainly a marker in time that got my attention. And then the the other big talk on campus, you're going to love this. There was very interesting scientific research being done in St. Louis, Missouri, at Washington University by a couple of doctors by the name of Masters and Johnson. Okay. And this was really the first serious study of human sexuality.
Yep.
And what was interesting on campus was the buzz was going around. There's these two doctors in St. Louis paying people to have sex, and they're watching them, and they hook all these instruments on them. And, you know, they now know what the female orgasm is all about. Any rate.
Whereas every man is still saying, I really wish I knew what that was all about.
And any rate, you know, that's another landmark in my life that it took until my college days for us to really study this and understand it. I mean, today we take all that for granted, but when I was a kid, that was not the case. In fact, I was given a book about sexuality just before I was married that told me that the ultimate was simultaneous orgasm. You know, and at any rate, I won't go. But it's just another. I just want to give you.
It's a change in the culture, in the cultural status quo, and where the society of the U.S. was going, and how times were changing.
These were some of the other scientific milestones that were happening, and that was happening a matter of miles from where these space capsules were being manufactured. Okay. So I'm just trying to give
groundbreaking, revolutionary science, all in Missouri.
That's right.
Love it.
You know, we think of Missouri, hillbillies and so forth, you know. At any rate, this was groundbreaking stuff. Well, the next thing, of course, that happened was John Glenn did make orbited the Earth, and he was the third U.S. man in space. And on February 20th, 1962, he made a number of orbits in Friendship 7 in a single-place Mercury capsule. And let me just say that if you ever get to anywhere where they have one of these capsules, they're in a number of museums.
Yeah.
But the National Air and Space Museum, part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.
I've been there. I've seen them, yeah.
I want you to stand beside one of those Mercury capsules and imagine climbing in this thing and being rocketed into space, because it's tiny. A Cessna 172 aircraft has far more room inside, like 10 times more room. I mean, you are sandwiched in this thing. Now, how do I know all that? Well, because after leaving college, I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and I got a job with McDonnell Aircraft.
Nice.
Now, if you have any strange, irrational, non-scientific beliefs in numerology, I hired in to McDonnell Aircraft, and I can never forget the date, on 6/6/66.
Too many sixes.
Well, if you're a biblical scholar, 666 is the mark of the devil.
Right.
Okay?
But you added one more 6, so that nullifies the first.
I have no idea. But I started working at McDonnell Aircraft. Now, I was working on the Phantom aircraft, and I actually hired in there as a technician, later moved on to teach courses to engineers. But I actually dropped out of college after my third year, went off to St. Louis, and like I say, started in as a technician there. But one of the real perks of working there was I worked in the building, which was all about aircraft electronic systems, right next to Building 101. Building 101 was the building where the Gemini and the Mercury capsules were manufactured.
Oh,
So
cool.
and I had a security clearance and I had the badges, so I could just walk over there on my lunch hour.
Hey, how's the space program going?
Yeah. And I actually had a friend of mine from high school. He was the valedictorian of the class ahead of me, and he was working on the Gemini program.
Wow.
And so I found out he was there, and we would go to lunch together in Building 101, and then he would take me through all of the areas where the capsule was being made, with the exception of the clean rooms. You know, we couldn't go in there without getting in suits and so forth.
Right.
But I could stand next to one of the capsules. I could open the door, look in, look at all the instrumentation. And, of course, this was like, for me, this was a kid in a candy shop, you know.
Right.
Now, one of the things that happened, well, let me back up and ask you a question. Now, I have it in my notes, so you can't look ahead in my notes.
I'm not looking at the notes.
But you may know that we were very lucky in our early days in the space program. And in fact, I'll digress and tell a story. When I went to lunch with my friend that worked on the program, we sat down at the lunch table in Building 101, and he introduced me to a number of other people working on the Gemini capsule. And this one guy was introduced to me as the guy who calculated the mean time between failures for each component in the space machine. And he was the one that calculated the reliability of the total system. And so after I understood, was introduced to him, I looked him in the eye and I said, I have a question for you. How many astronauts should be dead at this point based on your calculations? And he said one.
One.
Very matter-of-factly. Now, up to this point, there had been nobody in space injured in any way. But how many astronauts before men worked on the moon died as a consequence of playing a role? That is, they were on company time. They weren't necessarily in space, but they were practicing or doing things in the space program. How many of them died before men walked on the moon? And I'm going to go through and tell you, and I'll tell you the final total when we get through, because a lot of people don't know this, that there was some human, some sacrifice of and human courage involved in being a part of this program.
Yeah, I know there were. I know of a couple that just from watching The Right Stuff, movie from years back. Yeah. And by the way, if you haven't seen that movie, by all means, rent it. It does follow. It's fairly truthful. There's some poetic license, but it's a great movie. Yeah.
Now, I hired in June of '66, and I worked with a number of people, and I found out right after I moved there that there had been a bad accident back in February 28th, 1966. Two of the astronauts, Elliot C. and Charles Bassett, they were not in the first seven. They were in the next group after the first seven. And they were killed in a crash of a T-38 training aircraft that NASA used. And the irony of this crash is really mind-blowing. Let me tell you the details. First of all, they were flying up from Houston, and they were being followed in another jet by Sanford and Cernan. And they were about 15 minutes behind them. And it was a cloudy, foggy day in St. Louis. And so C and Elliot were doing an instrument approach on one of the main runways there. And when they broke out of the clouds, they were too far down the runway. They had come in a little too high. And rather than pull up and do what's known as a missed approach, go back into the clouds and get, using radio navigation, circle back and get on the instrument landing system a second time, they decided that they would try and stay below the clouds and circle the field and land on another runway. And the other runway that they chose, and if memory serves me correctly, it was runway 30. Right off the end of runway 30 was the building that I worked in later after this, and building 101, where the Gemini capsules were being manufactured. So they circled under the clouds, and the story I was told was that there was a building crane that had been erected, and that the beacon on it, anything near an airport that, is a tower, is supposed to have a beacon on it, and the beacon was not turned on during the day or whatever. And that they circled around and at the last second saw this tower was directly ahead of them coming out of the fog. And they turned quickly to try and avoid it, and they crashed into the top of Building 101. Now, warning, what I'm going to tell you in the next little bit is graphic. They CNN, when they say the next pictures, well, my next description is going to be somewhat graphic. The aircraft, this T-38, went through an air conditioning cooling tower on top of the building. It actually, the wreckage ended up in the parking lot just beyond the building. But it hit the top of the roof, went through this cooling tower, and one of the pilots was decapitated by one of the I-beams that goes across the top of the cooling tower. And the other fellow was killed instantly as well. And the wreckage of the plane ended up in the parking lot or immediately beyond it. But in addition, they estimated that if they had hit 3 feet lower on the side of this building instead of right at the edge of the roof, they would have gone down into the building and wiped out the entire Gemini project.
Wow.
Okay?
Wow.
And they, as luck would have it, they were deflected up by this cooling tower and crashed in the parking lot beyond it. Now, the other personal story I can tell you after I was working there is I was talking to one of my fellow workers, and I brought this up and asked him to tell me about it. He said, "Oh, I'll never forget it." He said, "I was at work that day," and he said the PA system came on in the building we worked in and said, there's been this crash, and we have decided to evacuate the area until we get things under control. By the way, there was a water main from this cooling tower that was broken, and it flooded all of Building 101. The flooding didn't do a whole lot of damage, but they had to send everybody home and get the flooding stopped and clean up the area and So they happened to send this guy home as well. Said, "Go home for the day, come back to work tomorrow. We'll hope we'll have things in order." So he went out to the parking lot to get in his car. Now, the parking lot his car was in was the parking lot where the crash actually happened, but they had it roped off by this time, and his car was several hundred yards away. So as he was getting into his car, he looked down, and there was a pilot's flight glove beside his car. And he bent over and picked it up, and there was a hand in it.
Ah!
So he, of course, left it there, went and got, the appropriate people who were already gathered around the accident investigating and said, "This is what I found. Please come. This is part of your, evidence."
Yeah.
But can you imagine? That would,
That would shake anybody up a bit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it just shook him right to the core.
Wow.
Now, Alan Shepard, the first man in space from the U.S., and Deke Slayton flew into St. Louis the next day to lead the investigation. And, 1 week later after this accident, by the way, Sanford and Cernan landed 14 minutes later without knowing what had happened.
Yeah.
And now, okay, 2 of their fellow workers, 2 of their fellow astronauts had just been killed. 1 week later, Sanford and Cernan were launched into orbit in the Gemini capsule. So, quite literally, the show must go on. They, that was when they were scheduled to go. By the way, they were all coming up to St. Louis to fly the Gemini simulator in St. Louis. Now, the next...
them all together.
Yeah.
We do need to take a break very quickly as we're getting closer to the end of the hour. We need to take a break very quickly to thank our sponsor. And our sponsor, audiblepodcast.com. This episode of Maxwell's House is brought to you by audible.com. Audible.com is the leading provider of audio books and periodicals, anything you want. Their library is well over 60,000 titles at this point in time, and they have genres everywhere from science to science fiction. You could probably even take a listen to a book about the history of the U.S. in space. And I hope, Ray, do you have a suggestion for our listeners in case they're interested in checking out audible.com? Because audible.com is offering a free, I think it's a free trial. You can download one audiobook for free if you go to audiblepodcast.com/house. And if they do, what should they maybe consider checking out, Ray?
Well, one of the things that I'm listening to right now is a book entitled What the Dog Saw.
What the Dog Saw.
And this is by Malcolm Gladwell, who, of course, wrote Tipping Point and Blink and a number of other books. And this is yet some more anecdotal stories and his analysis. And What the Dog Saw is just one story in this book, but it's about Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. And it's his analysis of why he thinks Cesar Millan has been so successful at what he does. And I won't say any more than that. You'll have to download the book and listen to it. But it's a fascinating read. I must say, I want to be fair since I am on a science program.
Good to be fair. Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell is not always very scientific in his analysis, but his reading is highly entertaining and highly thought-provoking, and you can do your own analysis of the evidence that he presents and so forth. But I found it quite an entertaining read.
It sounds like a fun book. I do like Malcolm Gladwell a lot, so this sounds like something that might be quite interesting to follow up with. And if anyone is interested in downloading What the Dog Saw as their free trial audiobook download, again, the website is www.audiblepodcast.com/house. And we'd like to thank audible.com for supporting Maxwell's house.
Indeed.
So on with the stories.
Well, let me answer the question I asked earlier. There were 8 astronauts between the time of the beginning of the program until men walked on the moon. There were 8 killed in accidents. Now, the most famous were the 3 killed in the Apollo 1 fire that happened on the ground. And all the rest were killed in flying accidents, with the exception of Edward Givens, who was killed in a car crash. So 7 of the 8 were killed doing their astronaut work or training to go into space. Now, I'll just speed this up here. After I worked at McDonnell Aircraft, I then came to Canada, and I eventually went to work for McDonald Detweiler and Associates. I have a thing working for McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis, and then McDonnell Detweiler in Vancouver. And I designed and built one of the first high-res satellite ground stations for Canada for the Tyros-N satellite. And these stations were installed in Czechoslovakia, Indonesia, Japan, Hong Kong, and Greenland while I was working there. And because we played a role in satellite ground stations in the aerospace industry, while I was there, Joe Engel and Richard Truly, who were the second astronauts to fly the Columbia Space Shuttle, they came by and shook our hands and talked to us and thanked us for being part of the, the aerospace program. And by the way, their flight was the first flight where the Canadarm, which is flown on every flight subsequently, was tested. And that was Canada's contribution to the space program at that time. Now, my next question, which I always find interesting, is, remember, in 1957, there wasn't a single artificial thing in orbit around the Earth. Not a thing. When I go out, I'm an amateur astronomer, amongst other things, and I look at my telescope. If I look through my telescope for more than an hour, I never, ever do that without seeing at least one satellite pass through the view of my telescope. Now, remember how small the view of my telescope is. I have a Celestron C8, and I have various lenses that I put on it, but I'm looking at a teeny tiny part of the sky. And every time I do it, with an hour of watching, I always see a satellite pass through. Now, what did we get from this space program? I just want to mention a few things quickly. They did a lot of basic research, that MEMS technology, integrated circuits, a great deal of medical research about the effects on man in space, but they brought a lot of that medical research back and is in medical instruments today and medical remote sensing, rocket technology, weather satellites. I played a role in that. And communication satellites, of course. So, I just want to wrap up with one question. If we look back in cosmic history, we know that there have been very, very large objects that have smashed into the Earth and all the other celestial bodies. Look at the moon, you can see all the pockmarks because there's no atmosphere or water to erode them. The Earth may have had just as many impacts, but, things grow back and cover them up.
Yeah.
So, and we also know that there have been large extinctions from these impacts on the Earth. So my question is, do we need a lifeboat? Ultimately, is the space program about preserving human life by having somewhere else to go if we are impacted by some of this debris? It's going to happen someday. It may be 100 years from now. It may be 10,000 years from now.
Or as some people are suggesting, maybe it'll be within the next 20 years. What is it?
Well,
2029 is the next close encounter that we're supposed to have.
Right. And of course, the Mayan calendar says it'll happen in 2012. At any rate, it's interesting. Will the human race get it together to work on that or not? Who knows? Next week, I am planning on doing a program on physics across many fields, because what I found in my engineering studies is that certain physical aspects like aliasing, anti-aliasing, digitizing things, they have the same impact whether you're talking about audio, electronics, mechanical design, or optical design and printing presses and things. So I'm going to try and show some central threads, if you understand basic physics, that go through all of these areas. And I'm also going to answer some color questions that I've collected since my last color shows. And then in another show, I've decided that this space thing was an interesting way to go through my life. I'm going to go through my life and tell you aviation stories and how aviation has progressed during my 65 years of riding on Spaceship Earth.
This sounds like a very exciting perspective on what your show is going to be over the next few weeks. I'm excited. It's history, it's science, physics, color, all sorts of stuff. I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this.
Good.
It'll be good.
We'll have fun exploring those areas.
Yes, I think we will have a lot of fun, and I hope that everyone will take the tour with us of your life in science, or is it your life in color? Maybe. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. If you're watching live today, if you are interested in downloading this podcast at other times, you can always find it in iTunes. It is in the TWiT directory, in the iTunes podcast directory. You can also find it on twit.tv. And Ray, if people have more questions, color questions to add to your growing pile, where should they send their emails?
They can reach me at ray@twit.tv. And I always look forward to reading the emails that I get.
Yeah, emails are always fun. They always add a little bit to the experience of doing the show, because you're not doing it inside of a bubble anymore. You're suddenly getting feedback. And
I hope someday that we'll have an even better way of taking questions on the air. I know we're working on it, and if we do, I look forward to it.
I look forward to it as well, and I hope I hope to get trained up on that. I think talk-in is one of the methods that we have used in the past a little bit, and that hopefully we'll be able to use more in the future. People can always try if they want to send video questions. You can use Vidly, that's vid.ly, and you can tweet your video questions. And if maybe we can use the hashtag TwitMH. So TWITMH for Maxwell's house. And then we can search through the hashtags using the hashtag, that's a £, and TWITMH to see if anyone has sent in video questions. And then maybe we can use those questions on future shows.
Sure thing.
So that's at least one way around it. It's not live conversation, but it's at least something that we can do.
Right.
Yeah. So thank you once again, Ray. This has been really, really interesting, and I love the bringing together, the melding of science and history, and this perspective on where we are now and how we got here and what we've been through to get here. Mm-hmm. Because there is so much history behind. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
And I wonder if what it would take today to get us to get as engaged in science as in 1957 when Sputnik, would it have to be that fearful a thing? Yeah.
Do we have to be afraid of some nation beating us, stealing our stuff, bombing us with nuclear weapons, whatever it happens to be?
Yeah. Have we got lazy in that area because we're not threatened right now?
That's a good question. I think that's a question to put forward to the audience as well. What does everyone out there think? Interested in knowing what you think. So that's it for Maxwell's House. Thank you everyone once again for joining us. We'll be back next week. Thanks.